I'm gonna read a little bit from my book, and I'm gonna talk a little bit more because personally I think readings are kind of boring, and you can read the book and it's the same stuff that I would say standing here. It really is. I don't think I'm a great deliverer, so I think I can give you more by just giving you some background about the book, how certain things came to be, or extra stuff that's not actually written in the book. And also if you have any questions at the end, or you want to just discuss anything I talk about here, I would love to hear from you. It's always, people have very strong reactions to self-help, so it's always really interesting for me to hear like where people are coming from. They love it, they hate it. Everybody has a crazy cousin who's like, doing some weird seminar and they want me to just say something they can take back to their cousin and be like, you're an idiot. So I really enjoy people's relationships to self-help. This book kind of came about by accident. I was telling some classes that I visited today. I started out as a playwright and then I did an MFA in fiction, and I wasn't really planning on writing a nonfiction book. My dad is a self-help writer, and so I knew this world very well because I had literally grown up in it. I mean, we all grew up in it, but I had actually grown up in the house with the guy, writing about parenting and psychology. He's a child psychologist. And sometimes I would even be in the book, so he would make reference to me and my behavior, a technique that he had tried on me. So writing this book was very meta because I was like writing about him, writing about me when I was a child, now I'm an adult. It was like very, very interesting to me, the sort of weird relationship of both of us writing about each other for different reasons and purposes. There were a lot of things in our house, a lot of self-help books. My dad was a huge fan of affirmations. Every morning when he dropped me off at school, he would say, don't forget, today's the first day of the rest of your life. And that was really annoying, and I think he was doing it to annoy me, but I think I often wonder what cumulative effect it had over many, many years, hearing that every single morning. I don't know what it was, but I feel like it must have had some effect. And so my dad, by the time I started thinking about writing this book, had written about 40 self-help books. A lot of them were workbooks or shorter books. They're not all big books, but 4 or 5 of them had been published by major publishers, but he didn't have the level of success of somebody that you would recognize, like Dr. Phil or Dr. Oz, these sort of celebrity self-help people. And I think he was always a little bit perplexed about why that was, because he kind of had the right information, and he's a very personable, likable guy. And he would do like some small TV appearances, but it just never amounted to like amazing sales. And he'd heard about a workshop that one of the co-writers of Chicken Soup for the Soul was hosting, and the workshop was for people who wanted to be self-help writers. And I kind of said, Dad, why are you going to this? You are a self-help writer. You've been doing this for a long time. But he thought maybe, there's something that I'm not doing right, and if I could only figure out what that was, that I could learn by going to this workshop in one weekend. It's not a huge commitment. It was $1,000, which is a lot of money. Why not? Why not try? And I think that's sort of the thing that gets everybody about self-help is that why not? Like maybe, just maybe, the thing that I need to know is somewhere out there, and it's easy enough to find that I can just go read it in a book or go to a workshop. So I was really delighted by this idea of a bunch of people who wanted to be self-help writers getting together in a conference room and learning how to be self-help writers. So I asked him if I could come along. I wasn't even sure I was going to write about it, although I was pretty sure it was going to be strange and funny. So like the odds were pretty good that I was going to write something about it. So the first thing I'm going to read is just a little bit from the experience at that conference. And I called Mark Victor Hansen MVH. Those are his initials because I got tired of writing out Mark Victor Hansen. So in this scene, Mark Victor Hansen appears for the first time, and we've actually been waiting for him for 2 hours. I don't know what the purpose of that was, but people were getting kind of agitated. And it was like a room full of 600 people, which is really a lot of people who've all paid $1,000, and to like not see the main speaker for 2 hours, people were starting to like almost be on the edge of revolt. Mark Victor Hansen bounded onto the stage. The audience erupted in wild enthusiasm, jumping out of their chairs. MVH crossed the stage more like an NBA star than a middle-aged, balding self-help guru, pumping his arms and down. Standing tall at 6'4", the man who called himself the authority on human potential had a penchant for purple dress shirts. He was wearing one now, as in most photos. He later revealed that purple is the highest color on the electromagnetic spectrum. There is a reason behind every decision MVH makes, and most of it is heavily based on market research. FYI, the number 7 is also very powerful, it's in quotes. Information is the most profitable product in the world, intoned MVH with funereal seriousness. He then told us the story of chicken soup. The first book, Chicken Soup for the Soul, was a collection of feel-good stories about individual success and triumph over adversity. Since then, the Chicken Soup book buyer has been offered chicken soup stories for every conceivable collective: moms, scuba divers, stamp collectors, abuse survivors, Christians, hockey fans, dog people, cat people, breast cancer survivors, married people, back pain sufferers, stressed people, brides, teens, preteens, Canadians, country music fans, grandmothers, runners, teachers, college students, golfers, twins, divorcees, empty nesters, Black people, Jewish people, Latinos, caregivers, dieters, entrepreneurs, gardeners, menopausal women, dentists, ocean lovers, and veterans. That's not the complete list, but that's a lot of them. The story of how he and partner Jack Canfield came to publish their first book was the first of innumerable inspirational tales we would hear that weekend, and it seemed fitting that their narrative of publishing inspirational stories was itself an inspirational story. The bread and butter of the chicken soup empire and almost all self-help narratives is the inspirational story. In fact, over the course of the weekend, I would hear this particular story from various people more than 20 times. And each time, the number of New York publishers who rejected the book got higher. The highest was 144, which is actually ridiculous. Nobody would send something out 144 times. And the number of copies sold got larger, largest 17 million, and the payoff got concomitantly better. I will admit to you right now that I quickly grew to love this story, and furthermore, that it weirdly ignited in me an exponentially growing urge to shout, "In your face!" As such, I submit to you that these predictable and formally drab success narratives, while bizarre and improbable, are unhateable. A man returns home to find his wife and children dead. Feeling his life has no purpose, about to commit suicide, he rescues a baby from a swimming pool and reaffirms his usefulness in the world. A nurse works in a hospital caring for cripples, not my word, when a crane smashes through the window and paralyzes her. Now she lobbies against the government and is famous and rich. Yes, the ways in which these stories manipulate our emotional response are evident, yet, despite such knowledge, the formula works. These stories are tiny units of powerful emotional incitement. Even for a cynical reader, is there not something potentially cord-touching in these stories? Do you hate babies and cripples? MVH employed the same technique used in his books to emotionally ignite and detonate his audience. With Pollyanna-ish optimism, he shared story after story of turning tragedy into triumph, lemons into lemonade. For instance, did you know that Sylvester Stallone wrote Rocky in 3 days? That it was turned down by every major Hollywood producer? That some bonehead wanted to cast Robert Redford as Rocky? This gem elicited many a horrified gasp. Did you know that Stallone sold it for nothing on the condition that he would play the lead? Did you know that David fought Goliath with only 1 stone? MVH used this exact story sequence to incite zealous, if slightly unfocused, fervor in his audience. He paced the stage, he waved his hands emphatically, the purple shirt shagged back and forth. He insisted we sing the Rocky theme song, he really did. Truly terrible humming ensued. Some people were confused and sang Eye of the Tiger. Yeah, I think it's in the movie too. MVH's never say die ethos was dubious but seductive. After all, there's a theory behind the power of the inspirational story, implicit and often outright acknowledged in almost every self-help book since pre-biblical times, that hearing about other people's success gives us hope, and hope is the backbone of perseverance and triumph. Have you ever noticed that when you encounter misfortune, many people will tell you a similar story from their own lives? That 99% of the time, the moral of said similar story is that they overcame said similar situation, and most probably you will too? MVH encourages us to start from where you're vulnerable. It endears you to the audience. The power of these stories, according to MVH, could not be overestimated. He insisted we need heart-touching, soul-penetrating stories. That's the first part I'm going to read. So it was kind of like a religious revival scene. The people were so into it. They were crying. They were freaking out. They were calling people on their cell phones. And so I felt like I was witnessing something important. I didn't know what it was, but anything that gets people this excited, I felt like, okay, well, that's something worth looking into. And then I went home and I started researching the history of self-help, because I always like to look at the history of something just to find out the context and to learn more. And in this case, I was really surprised to learn how old it was. Some of the first books that were explicitly acknowledged as self-help books were from the Victorian era, and they were bestsellers in the Victorian era. In 1859, a man named Samuel Smiles wrote a book called Self-Help, and the Bible was the #1 bestseller, and Self-Help was the #2 bestseller, and that was the same year that Origin of the Species was published. So it was like huge. And interestingly enough, this book, Self-Help, was basically chicken soup for the soul. It was like a collection of inspirational stories about people who came from nothing, achieving a lot. At that time, it was all men because they did stuff like that. But so this narrative is obviously something that has appealed to us for a very long time. And in the book, I also talk about earlier predecessors, even though they're not acknowledged as self-help, parts of the Bible that kind of read like advice giving, or rules that you should follow, ways to live. Ancient Greek texts by the Stoic writers that are sold in the self-help section today. I mentioned in the class I visited today, The Art of War is this really popular book now. Apparently businessmen love to buy it. And it's like an ancient Chinese military treatise, and now it's sold as a self-help book. That's really old. Ancient China was a really long time ago. So it's kind of fascinating that this stuff has this kind of longevity, and that a book that was meant to be one thing, thousands of years later can be used for something entirely different. So I got interested in the ways that all books could be self-help books. And, obviously they weren't trying to write a self-help book, but sort of that helped me define a little bit the parameters of what a self-help book was, thinking a little bit outside of the box. So one of the things I was thinking about was the ways in which all of us are affected by self-help, even if we don't read self-help books. I was pretty anti-self-help when I started the book. I kind of thought my dad's aphorisms were a little goofy, and I had not ever bought a self-help book for myself. But I really challenged myself to kind of find some value in it, and one of the things I started thinking about was the way in which self-help is so much a part of the culture that you don't actually have to go out and buy a book to kind of receive the messages that you would if you bought a book. So I'm just going to read a short section. This is from the prologue. It's nearly impossible to live in the world and escape self-help. We are surrounded all the time by its bastard derivatives. In my local auto body shop, a yellowed sign hanging over the saddest couch in the world proclaims, "We create our tomorrows by what we dream today." It's like seriously so weird, that scene. An email in my inbox tells me to take heart in this moment and know the best is yet to come. A poster in my hardware store of a kitten clinging to a tree branch proffers 3 simple words: hang in there. That's this image from the cover. These axioms may seem like throwaway items, mental tchotchkes that people use to shield themselves from the routine horrors of daily life. They may go unnoticed by most of us most of the time, but they exist in our peripheral vision, and I am one of those people who believes that we ingest these things accidentally, and that they must have some niggling, if not profound, effect on our psyches with the most unfathomable consequences. These aphoristic posters and bumper stickers and signs and calendars and pens and emails and t-shirts and coffee mugs contain small but constant assurances that the point of view of the universe towards us is not one of overwhelming indifference. This is another paragraph slightly later on. Although individual self-help books can be simplistic, self-help itself is complex, contradictory, and hard to pin down. We resist lumping our own unique misery or transcendence with the dumb, hopeless problems of strangers. And at the same time, we feel reassured that we're not alone. The concept appeals to our nationalistic notions of self-sufficiency, but the phrase self-help carries a stigma among intelligent, educated adults. I think this has something to do with the fact that there will undoubtedly come a time in every intelligent, educated adult's life where they will be helpless and desperate, and this certainty is something we all prefer to ignore. So I'm going to jump ahead in the book a little bit and talk about my dad again. He was very nice and let me tag along and write all sorts of things about him, which I'm sure he later came to regret, but at the time he was very just happy to have me around. And this part of the book is about how my dad became an expert on something called the choking game, which he actually knew nothing about. As a child psychologist and a self-help writer, he would often be asked to go on TV and comment on something having to do with child psychology. That's just something that CNN likes to do or Oprah likes to do. They have an expert. That's how Dr. Phil started, as sort of the expert on Oprah's show. And they come as sort of a voice of authority to give the whole thing some validity. Now that I know enough about it, it shocks me that anybody buys it at all, but I think before that I kind of thought, oh yes, it's an expert, of course. And in this chapter I think a lot about, well, what makes an expert? Like, what do your qualifications have to be for you to comment on something? Certainly a lot of self-help books, the only thing that person did was write a self-help book. They're not a PhD, they don't have any qualifications, but some of them are PhDs and they do have qualifications, and there's no way to kind of really evaluate people who really know what they're talking about from people who just had an idea. So the choking game is the phrase that they use to describe this thing where kids choke each other. I actually had never heard of it. A lot of people that I knew were like, oh yeah, we used to do that. I guess when you cut off oxygen to your brain by choking yourself or your friends, you get like a hallucination or a feeling of euphoria, which is fun. And then you pass out, and that's like what people do for fun. I don't know, it's kind of shocking, but this is a game that apparently children have been playing for a long time, and a lot of my friends played when they were children. And it was not known to me, and it was not known to my dad. But he got called one day by a producer who wanted to do a segment on the choking game, and they said to my dad, as a child psychologist, will you come on and talk about, children's point of view and their behavior? And he was like, sure. So then he accidentally became the choking game expert, because they didn't really have anyone to fill that role. And so once my dad made that one appearance, then the next time the child would die, it's like a very sad thing that would precipitate these television appearances from my dad. They would just call my dad, because then they would Google choking game and my dad's name would pop up, and that's pretty much all producers do. And they would call my dad, and then my dad would kind of reluctantly go on. And he was so mad about it because he had kind of wanted to be famous his whole life, but not for this. It was just so morbid, and he didn't really feel like he was doing anything good, because you just couldn't weigh the benefit against the harm. When you go on TV and talk about stuff, it actually makes people do that thing who don't know about it, but then maybe it warns some parents. So he was very ambivalent about the whole enterprise. I probably was not super supportive about it. I started calling him Dr. Choking Game. So I just like to tease my dad. So I'm just going to read a short segment from the choking game chapter. Also another thing about experts is I found this great quote from Mark Twain, who said, an expert is an ordinary fellow from another town. And I thought that's kind of fit well with self-help experts. For my father, being an expert on the choking game was a fast and loose business. Once he was called while on vacation at his sister-in-law's in Los Angeles. A producer from CNN informed him that a child had accidentally hanged himself in Sacramento. They asked if they could speedily send a camera crew to his sister-in-law's house. They also wanted to know if she had any rope. So you can show us how it happened, explained the producer, as though that were a normal request. My father refused. What if we bring a rope? Asked the producer. If I show kids how to hang themselves on TV, my father said, they will go do it. The CNN producer seemed surprised by this notion, so no rope. On another CNN show, an anchorman asked my father, in all seriousness, "Dr. Shapiro, should children hang themselves?" "No," said my father, as though there were another possible answer, "they should not." Finally, the media seemed to lose interest. I think my father was mostly relieved. Despite his dream of having a more mainstream audience, he had always been ambivalent about these television segments on the joking game. On the one hand, it was a public service of sorts. On the other hand, whenever one talked about the choking game, the incidences of it increased. It was impossible to weigh the benefit against the harm. A few years passed. Then in the spring of 2009, my father received a call from the Dr. Oz show. 3 months earlier, he was told, an 18-year-old in Florida had accidentally killed himself while hanging from a belt tied to a closet rod. The parents assumed it was suicide. They never heard of the choking game. Would my father like to be on the Dr. Oz show as their expert? He sighed, "Sure." Less than a week later, I met my father on a sunny day in front of 30 Rockefeller Plaza. After going through NBC security, we were escorted to a green room. The room was windowless and beige. The only decorations on the wall were 3 framed headshots of Dr. Oz, a man who bears some resemblance to an underfed werewolf. It was freezing cold, and I used my coat as a blanket. There was a TV, but we couldn't figure out how to turn it on. We had 2 hours to kill. Once I was in a green room with an old man, a monkey, and an accordion, said my father. Today, because the other guests were the family and friends of the recently deceased teenager, we were not sharing a room, a fact I was grateful for. It was hard for me to understand why anyone who had suffered this kind of loss would want to expose themselves on national television. I asked my dad what he thought their motivation might be. "They feel very guilty," said my father. "They thought it was a suicide. Even the coroner had never heard of the choking game." A gurney rolled by the green room with a dummy on it covered by a thin sheet. "I hope that's not a real body," joked my dad, "or the last guest on the show." I rolled my eyes, but it turned out my father wasn't completely wrong. In a new twist on the usual choking game story, the show had decided to start the segment with a reenactment of an autopsy. A real medical examiner named Dr. G, who, like Dr. Oz, had her own eponymous TV show, was going to simulate the autopsy on a dummy. As reenactments go, it was firmly on the creepy side of an already creepy scale. Odder still, the dummy they were using was an old man, despite the fact that the choking game was played almost exclusively by teens and preteens. I wondered why they had made this unrealistic choice. I suppose they were squeamish about doing an autopsy of a plastic child on television, though given that they were comfortable televising a recreated autopsy with any verisimilitude, it seemed like an arbitrary place to draw the line. "Is the autopsy really necessary?" I asked my dad. "I think Dr. Oz is smart and well-intentioned," said my dad, "but he still has to entertain." So after this happens, there's a very long scene with the producer, which is like hilarious and silly. And the producer comes in and he's for some reason obsessed with getting my dad to say that the choking game is addictive. And that's the one thing that my dad actually doesn't think the choking game is. He just thinks it's dangerous, like, because when people do it, they can die. That's really bad. And he's like, "I can say they die, like that's bad if you want to scare people." But I think maybe they had recorded a promo or something with like, "Is the choking game addictive?" Because the guy was so focused on trying to get my dad to say that, and eventually they went back and forth and agreed on the solution that was that Dr. Oz would say to my dad, "Dr. Shapiro, is the choking game addictive?" And he would say, "No, but it's very dangerous." Like they wouldn't just take out the question. So that was all very weird. But I'm not going to read you that part because it's a lot of dialogue and it's confusing when I start playing both parts. So that that was my dad being an expert on the choking game. It's been a while since that has come up, but you know, it could come up again at any time, and he always feels compelled to go to these things. Another point in the book that I'm going to read from, I'm not going to introduce too much, but it was a chance where like I actually had a problem that I could try using self-help, and in this case, I went to a self-help group which is different than the book because it's full of people, but it's defined because there's no expert or professional there. It's just sort of civilians that share the same issue. This chapter, by the way, is called A Fellowship of Nervous Freaks. I am afraid of crowds, elevators, and heights. I am, to such a degree that I avoid it entirely, afraid of flying. People in my life, even people who know me well, are always surprised to hear I am afraid of flying, because my not flying is something few people have occasion to witness. Not flying is less obvious than not leaving the house or not going to parties. Not flying is generally an inconspicuous event, although at age 21, I once dropped a boyfriend off at the end of a highway exit ramp to the airport because I was too afraid even to drive up to the terminal. As if, while I waited 30 seconds for him to unload his bags, a plane might crash into my car. But fear is not reasonable. Fear dwells in the realm of imagination, where anything is possible, except, of course, one's perfect safety. In the world of fear, walking down the street and not having a piano fall on your head is the least likely scenario. I think part of me believed that my fear was charming because it resulted in ridiculous stories, such as the one about the time I took a 4-day train ride to Seattle rather than fly. That's a really crazy thing to do, I don't recommend it. I was the only non-octogenarian on that excruciatingly long voyage, during which I lived entirely on power bars and tiny bottles of wine. The train attendants had taken to calling me New York, and every time I walked into the dining car, they would shout, "Here comes New York," which I found really horrifying. Consequently, I left my tiny berth only once a day, when I walked the length of the train to buy 4 single-serving bottles of red wine that I shoved furtively into my purse, once prompting the train cafe proprietor to remark, "You're my kind of lady." My fear was not charming to people who wanted to travel with me, but that was an extremely small percentage of people. My father was one of those unfortunates. My father traveled frequently, usually by himself. Despite the fact that I always said no, he continually invited me to exciting destinations that required a plane trip. In 1999, he had talked me into attending a fear of flying self-help group. The facilitator was a former fearful flyer herself. We met every Thursday night at LaGuardia Airport. The first day, the instructor asked each of us what specifically we were afraid of. "I'm afraid of the wings falling off the plane," said one woman. All the other people in the room, afraid of the wings falling off the plane, let's call them the wings people, nodded and said yes and amen and showed nonverbal forms of agreement like smacking a triumphant hand on the table, vigorous head bobbing, grave furrowing of eyebrows. Meanwhile, everyone else, myself included, thought this was the most ludicrous thing we'd ever heard. The wings falling off? We rolled our eyes at each other. We smirked. Then someone said, "I'm afraid of turbulence." I was one of the turbulence people. We turbulence people were stone-faced, nodding in pensive, moribund agreement that turbulence was the greatest threat to mankind since smallpox and measles. The wings people looked amused and rolled their eyes and shook their heads at what they perceived to be an entirely unwarranted fear. It went on this way for a while, the room factioning into the explode in midair people, the surprise lightning storm people, the plane might just fall out of the skies, the what if we run out of oxygens. Each of us had our own hierarchy of fear, where my personal fear was at the top of the list and other people's fear was unfathomable. An unlucky few started to fear new things they hadn't previously considered. The whole scene was dismaying. If we couldn't even be sympathetic to each other's fears, how could we expect anyone unafraid of flying to relate to us? More concerning still, was my turbulence fear really just as nutty as the wings people's fear? That was a very funny class in which I did actually begin flying again, so that worked. The last part I'm going to read about is the chapters about the future of self-help and where self-help is going. Technology, a lot of ebooks are happening, and there's certainly self-help ebooks, but there's also apps on your phone that can help you track your weight loss or your mood. And in this particular chapter, my dad decided to create an anti-suicide app. And this was personal for him and me because At this point in the book, you learn that my mother had committed suicide when I was a baby, and it was something that my dad had never talked about. So I was kind of like happy that he was doing this, but it was also really weird because it was an app, and I just don't think that that's like a great way to handle suicidal thoughts. But my dad had a different point of view. And he was working at the time for a company that sold self-help products to the military. The military actually has a whole mental health division, and suicide is a huge problem for them. And this company comes up with products and games and books that they give to military families, and suicide prevention is a big issue. So in this scene, my dad and I are in Washington, D.C., and we're actually going to the annual meeting of the Association of the United States Army, and my dad has a little booth where he's trying to sell, some of his products to military and army organizations, and he's also presenting the app for the first time. I wasn't supposed to be there. As you might imagine, any event associated with the Army is not exactly open to the public. My father had borrowed a plastic ID badge from his colleague, Sandy Collins, which he put around my neck. "If anyone asks, you're Sandy Collins," he stage whispered. Once inside, I was surprisingly nervous. I tried not to make eye contact with anyone and walked quickly, with feigned confidence. The ground floor of the convention center had little on it except a few hardy potted plants. A glut of men in business suits and army uniforms talked on their cell phones, walked with purpose, checked their email. My father and I rode down an escalator in front of a movie screen showing a commercial for new helmet technology set to Rambo-esque music. It was like entering a violent video game. As we turned a corner into the main exhibition area, we were surrounded by life-size tanks, assault rifles, missile launchers, bazookas, biohazard suits, full-body armor, bulletproof uniforms, more tanks, more guns, guys picking up guns and pretending to shoot them, remote-controlled robots outfitted with cameras and bombs and missile launchers. We passed a mannequin wearing an all-black, all-rubber hazmat suit, where the only exposed part of the human body was a tiny hole around the eyes, nose, and mouth. The suit was too large for the mannequin. Large rubber hand-like objects hung limply by the mannequin's side, having the eerie effect of an intact human skin with the bones, muscle, and blood siphoned out of it. We passed a sand-colored tank with tires taller than I was. To my right, a tall, muscular man with shorn hair talked on his cell phone while leaning casually on a missile launcher. He might have been talking to his wife about dinner, but anything you do while leaning on a missile launcher takes on an outsized drama. "Wow," said my dad. "Wow," I echoed. "Well, this is weird." "It's like a new frontier of weirdness for you," I agreed. "Congratulations." "Thanks," he said. The room echoed with the muted sounds of 1,000 conversations. I tried to imagine what sorts of exchanges might be taking place. Does this tank come in other colors? How much does this AK-47 weigh? Surveying the overwhelming scene, I leaned on a large black metal thing until I noticed the sign that said, "Stay clear, turret moves without warning." My father had been invited by a company he freelanced products for. Military Community Awareness, or MCA, represented the softer side of this convention. With my father's aid, they created products to help Army families deal with challenges like distance, moving frequently, and loss. While a majority of the products for MCA were self-help workbooks, they also had magnets, coloring books, positive message bookmarks, and self-help pens. I had a pen in my bag for several months that read "Coping with Being Apart." It contained a scroll that, when unfurled, revealed bullet points on the 4 stages of separation and helpful remedial tips. My father had come up with a concept for these pens, as well as most of MCA's products on various mental health topics tailored for military families. The latest product my father had developed for them was a self-help app. The app part wasn't unusual. Apps had recently become the new frontier for self-help and were accessible to anyone with a smartphone. What was unusual, for my father anyway, was that the app was for suicide prevention. Suicide is one of the military's biggest mental health challenges. The military has the highest suicide rate in the US. My father's app was called Operation Reach Out. When he first told me about it, I was surprised. In all of his game making, book writing, and toy creating, he had never made a product addressing suicide. My father had in fact made such a thorough habit of not discussing my mother's death that few of his friends and colleagues even knew about it. Now he found himself exposed. At first I didn't tell anyone, he said, that I had a personal connection. For months he had worked on the app with colleagues without telling anyone that his first wife had committed suicide. When he finally shared his story, he told me he felt relieved. It was an important thing for me to disclose. I had mixed feelings. I was glad that my father was finally facing this consequential event in our lives, and I thought it was a crucial topic to address. However, the idea of an app for suicide prevention seemed insufficient. Even the word app was foreshortened. Suicide seemed too vast, too serious, and too dangerous to be dealt with via smartphone. Apps, in my view, were for playing sextuple word challenge on the subway and checking the weather. But my father disagreed. This is the future of self-help, he said. What's better, a book sitting on a shelf somewhere, or a tool that people will carry with them in their pocket every day? So that was weird. And I also met a guy who was building a robot that was a weight loss aid, and the idea was that you would buy this robot for like $200, and it would be like a coach that lived in your house, and he was working on this prototype, and that whole thing seemed very strange to me, but he was convinced it was going to be a success. I haven't seen it yet, but he said he had investors interested, and he had come from MIT, and MIT had helped him in the development of this robot that was kind of responsive. It would ask you questions about your weight and your food habits, and then it would give you answers based on your answers. So there's some weird stuff in the works for self-help, robots and apps, and just websites and forums. It's really easy to find a community of anybody these days, and in some ways that's really great. I think in some ways it's really isolating, and it's going to be less encouraging to people to like actually leave their houses and go meet other people with those problems. Like me in the Fear of Flying group, actually in the airport, there was something to being around other people that I appreciate. But I'm going to sort of end there on that question of sort of like, how do you feel about the technology or the future of self-help or self-help in general? If you want to tell me, or if you have any questions that you want to ask me, I am done reading. Does anybody have any self-help apps on their phone? What is it?
Maybe I should look up the name. Sam. It's an anxiety app made by the University of West England.
Huh.
Yes.
What do you think of it?
It's actually pretty good. It just has like a lot of breathing exercises and focusing things.
Huh.
And you can record your feelings throughout the day.
Okay. 1 point for my dad. Any questions?
I'm just curious about, like, so if your dad was on Dr. Oz's show, like, what was that experience like for him? I mean, like, being face to face with one of these guys who was so much like what he wanted to be, you know, like,
I think it was kind of uninspiring because he was disheartened by how little real information and real help was being given, and how much it seemed to be about just scaring people and upsetting people and getting them to watch the Dr. Oz show. He didn't seem to have any problem with Dr. Oz himself, and I think he kind of liked being on the shows. Like, he just likes going on TV and having people listen to stuff he has to say, but it's also important to him that he's saying things that he actually thinks are valuable and not just making stuff up. And he really hates Dr. Phil. Like, it's really fun to mess with my dad just by bringing up Dr. Phil, because he'll just go on a total rant about what a fraud Dr. Phil is. And he's an interesting one with credentials. Like, I think he has some credentials, like he studied psychology undergrad, but he doesn't have a PhD. But, you know, he's like America's doctor. So, is there a question in the back?
Is there anybody besides you out there that has done an examination of the whole world and the people of the self-help world? Is there anybody else? I've never heard of anybody doing that.
I mean, I looked before I started writing the book to make sure somebody hadn't already written it, so at that point, no, and I haven't really heard of anything that's doing exactly what I'm doing. There are certainly a lot of books where people try a bunch of self-help programs to see if they work. I kind of find those annoying.
Well, you'd have an original thesis for doing a doctorate on it.
Yeah, I mean, I tried really hard to find academic studies, but they're few and far between, and most of them are not American. There seems to be a real resistance in academia to talking about self-help, I guess, because it's considered lowbrow. Although there's plenty of people write dissertations on television and other stuff that's considered lowbrow. For some reason, people reserve like a special level of disdain for self-help.
I would assume that virtually the vast majority of people are people who have life experiences like your dad. They have an area of expertise, that's their specialty, and people who have, come through something and would like to share with other people. But did you find somebody out there who's made it a career? Self-help is their career, writing and.
Oh, a lot of people.
There are a lot of people that is their.
I mean, there's the really famous ones like Eckhart Tolle and The Power of Now and all that, but there's also people who just came up with an idea and they keep writing a certain kind of book. Like I think whoever wrote He's Just Not That Into You, they kind of keep that going with like a series. Series are like a really big way to make money in self-help, because if people buy the first one, I guess you buy the second one, which would suggest that the first one didn't help. But yeah, that's a way and people keep, sorry?
There is that most famous guy who's super handsome and, he's a big...
Tony Robbins, the giant?
Yeah.
He's an actual giant. There's a lot of people. This is a really big business, and a lot of them don't just write books. They do workshops where they charge people thousands of dollars to attend, so I think that's also where a lot of money is made. Audio tapes, apps. I think there are quite many, many people making a living off of self-help. I don't know if any of those people were at the conference that I went to with my dad, but it's not insane to think that people spend a lot. It's like an $11 billion industry. So there's money to be made.
Maybe you could take up doing workshops for people who aspire to get into the self-help industry.
I could do that. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that would be really good for my spirit. But if I never really broke, I'm definitely doing that.
I know you looked at so many, like the historical documents, books, old self-help books. What was something that was the most surprising thing to you that you found looking at some of these really dated materials? Did anything stand out?
I mean, probably the most surprising thing was how similar to today's self-help books they were. Like this self-help book was exactly like Chicken Soup for the Soul, just written, with other stuff. And there was a book that was basically the Atkins diet, but it had 19th century foods in it. So it was like liver and really gross things, but it was basically an all protein, no carb diet. There was this, and then there was this other book that was just weird, and I just have to tell people about it because I couldn't fit it in the book. But it was just so weird. There was a guy named Horace Fletcher who, I think in the late 1800s, and he developed this diet, and the book was called The ABCs or Menticulture, and it was all about chewing your food. So it was all about like masticating, and the movement became called Fletcherism after him, and it like went wild. Like people were so into it, but it was like chewing your food slowly is quite reasonable. What he was suggesting is really insane. Like he would list every food, like carrot, celery, watermelon, and he would say like, it should take you 7 minutes to chew a carrot. He recommended chewing soup and liquids because he thought it would help you better digest. I actually, when I read that, I tried to chew soup. Like it's not possible. But this was like such a huge thing, and like a bunch of famous writers were really into it. Like Henry James was like a huge Fletcherite, and John D. Rockefeller. They were like all super into this diet, and I just thought like this is the funniest thing. Like nobody's ever heard of it, and it's like the weirdest idea. I think it actually worked because I think you become completely disgusted by the idea of food if you actually chewed a carrot for 7 minutes. I also found this amazing TV show that I wanted to work into the book somehow but couldn't fit in. It was called The Diets That Time Forgot. It was a British reality competition where they had people try 3 diets from different historical eras, and one of them was Fletcherism, and the other one was Banting, which is basically the Atkins diet. And then there was another one from 1920 that was like calorie counting, and they put all these people in a house and they made them eat like all these old weird foods, and like it was like a dieting competition to see who would lose like the most weight on these weird diets. Britain has some really weird TV shows. I was like completely fascinated by every episode of this TV show because everything about it was weird. So yeah, Horace Fletcher, masticating.
So I was wondering, how do you differentiate between self-help and other things you might do for yourself? Like, last year I took German, and I did that because my son was in Germany for his senior year in high school, and then all of a sudden there was an empty nest, and I thought, oh, what can I do? Well, I think I'll do this. I mean, I didn't see it as self-help. It was just something cool to do and learn. And
Right.
I thought we could have great conversations in German when we got back. And then I thought, well, if that is sort of like self-help, then what about, so then Farah and I both like to write poems. So, I mean, that's like, is that a hobby? And is a hobby self-help? I mean, where does it stop being self-help and start being something that you're more willing to own?
I talked with one of the classes I visited today about this, and there's no easy answers because I would say that a German class is not self-help because it's a class taught by a person, so it's more about help, just straight up help or education. If you had maybe bought a book on German and tried to teach yourself, that would have been more of like a self-help situation, but you know, the basic concept of self-improvement is at play in your decision to take the German class. So these like divisions are not neat ones. And there's also a problem with the DIY movement overlapping with the self-help movement because those are very concrete, practical things that are very useful. You know, if you get a book on computer programming and you follow the directions and you can follow the directions, you'll probably learn to program a computer. It's not like a weight loss book where you probably won't lose weight because, you know, that's how those things work. Generally, I found that self-help books tended to be more on the topic of abstract psychological subjects like love and marriage and weight loss and like things that aren't so easy to do or not so concrete as like building a chair. But then that becomes problematic because you have like the For Dummies guides and the For Idiots guides, and they're publishing, you know, how to make a chair, and they're also publishing like Grieving for Dummies. And they're all under the same like moniker, so it becomes, and the format of the book is exactly the same. So they're like borrowing forms from each other, and it becomes like very confusing. And I think to me, that was one of the interesting things is the way that like self-help kind of just bleeds out into regular culture in an insidious way that you don't even really notice. But I think you're safe on the German class.
The poetry.
The poetry, I don't understand what you're saying about it being a hobby.
I think it just depends, but if it's something that you feel compelled to do because it makes you a happier person or something.
I guess if you're writing it only for yourself and you don't intend to show it to other people, you could make an argument that it had a, you know, self-help quality to it, but yeah.
I'm worried, I just was curious about where the...
Yeah, well, I'm curious about that too. I have tried to figure out for like 8 years like where the lines can be drawn, and they can't be drawn because self-help has gotten so like vague and nebulous. And you know, a self-help group where people meet and talk to each other is very different from a self-help book, but they're all kind of called self-help and considered self-help. And even technically, a self-help book is still getting help from someone. You're getting help from the author. It's just doing it on your own. So none of these things are like neat categories.
In class today, you mentioned that you sort of noticed a kind of recurrence, a resurgence of self-help manuals about every 30 years or so. Do you trace those to episodes of disruption or destabilization in some way in a culture where then, as you also say, people want to believe that they can assume control over something that seems to have gone out of their control? Because the Victorian self-help books, that's a culture where things are just going wildly out of control and people don't know how to behave, and so they're trying to figure it out. Would you say that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up because it was something I wanted to mention and I forgot to mention it. Self-help books are completely products of their time. I wish that somebody else who's not me would write a history book just told through the lens of self-help books, because you can completely tell what's going on in the culture by the self-help books that are popular at that time. During the Depression, you had books like Orchids on a Budget and books like not the Power of Positive Thinking, How to Make Friends and Influence People. There was a slew of books like that you didn't need to have things already. Like, you could just use yourself, and if you were yourself, then you could be successful. And that was because people didn't have a lot of stuff at that time, and they needed to be told that, you're good enough on your own, and you don't need to have a lot of money or experience, in order to get ahead. During World War II, there were a lot of self-help books about, there were ones called like What's That Plane? Which was like a book that sold 400,000 copies, and it was just about identifying planes that were flying overhead. So they really respond to the time in like a super concrete way. When there's a recession, you see a lot of books about making money. I don't quite understand the relationship with like weight loss to what's going on at the time, but I'm sure there's a connection. Because people get the self-help books that they want, it's like somebody is unconsciously or consciously responding to a need in the culture, and that's why people buy things, because they're afraid, like whatever people are afraid of or what they want at a specific time, those are the self-help books they're gonna buy. And I think, because it does give you a sense of control in uncertain times. And you would think that during the Depression, people would buy less self-help books because they had less money, but actually sales of self-help books went way up because people were feeling unstable, and the book is still pretty cheap. And it was a way for them to feel like they had control, in a situation where things were pretty dire. I really wish somebody would write that book. I really don't want it to be me. I think it would be so fascinating.
I'm curious if it seems like there's a movement lately with data, right? Like the Fitbit as like a tool to monitor yourself. And would you consider that sort of a self-help sort of situation?
Yeah, it comes out of it. I would say it's like maybe an arm of the movement. It's not exactly that, but it's anything that's kind of empowering you to take fitness or whatever into your own hands. Life hacker. I haven't thought too much about life hacking, but I'm sure that that's part of the DIY movement is so huge now, and there is some overlap with self-help culture. But those people would be like horrified to hear me say that, because those are exactly the people who think that self-help books are dumb and would never do them. That they're like farmsteading and buying these books about like how to grow your own chickens in your own backyard, and that doesn't really seem necessary either. Do people have ideas or thoughts about the sort of stigma of self-help, like why it's so reviled, or do you really love it? I'm just curious.
If we didn't have ideas about the stigma against self-help, reading parts of your book would help us to develop that sense of disdain, I think.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's compliment or not.
I think that the salesmanship of it makes it seem so suspect, like the snake oil salesman kind of bounding onto the stage.
Right.
It just seems.
And the amount of money changing hands.
Right.
I think in a situation where somebody's peddling help, it seems unseemly for a lot of money to be changing hands, although nobody thinks it's unseemly for a cancer surgeon to charge a lot of money. But then again, that's more of a tried and true profession, whereas most of the stuff doesn't really work. And a lot of it's common sense, and in some ways that means it's great advice because it's true, but it's also advice that you don't need to pay somebody for. In the back.
I think probably all of us, in the bookstore, there's going to be a title or two that makes us stop and go, I think all of us have some kind of appeal. Now, I would think that the number one book along these lines the many books would be How to Get Rich. I would think.
It's divided by gender. Women buy books about relationships and men buy books about money. But there's actually not a lot of statistical information defined. I mean, publishers are really secretive about sales, and people aren't doing academic studies, so like that's one of the few statistics that I actually know about people's buying habits. I also came across a statistic that 70% of people who buy self-help books are people who have bought self-help books before, so it tends to be kind of a repeat, more of a lifestyle than, you know. And that's kind of one of the problems that I have with it. It's like, when does it end? You know, when do you just get to take a break and stop improving yourself? Any questions? No? Should we wrap it up?
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much.